terms of a list of 3,000 chemicals to start off with is simply when you have 3,000 chemicals and you're trying to move down to the smaller and smaller circles, as Debbie showed, there's still going to be a prioritization process. So all you've done is exchange one problem for another, the problem of what to exclude then becomes the problem of what to exclude when you really have to make decisions. Not everything can go first. Just a few more comments. I think the DTSC has done a really good job of designing a program that will make their work manageable and meaningful. And I really do like this approach of starting with a limited number of chemical product combinations where changes can make a meaningful difference in public or environmental health. And I also think that the important aspect of this is for DTSC to be able to learn by doing. Nobody's done this before on in a public setting. I mean, I think we've done it for 50 years privately, but to go into this cold, we're able to do it because we understand our industry and our business very well. I think that's going to be a challenge here, but I think that the opportunity here is to learn by doing, be transparent. I hope that there's continual seeking of regular input and feedback, not just from stakeholders, but I hope from the Green Ribbon Science panel. I would like for this initial process to identify procedures that are robust and can serve as precedents for future assessments. I really think that it's important to get a better handle on the complexity of the process, especially what range of expertise will be needed. I think that's especially important as the agency moves towards certifying parties to perform these assessments. It could be that it's not possible for a single individual to have all the expertise needed to carry out the tasks, such that certification will need to be for not an individual, but a set of individuals or an institution that has a large bank of expertise. So let me just end by again, thanking you for inviting me to speak today and for allowing me to participate in the process. I think that this is groundbreaking work. I think it is a grand experiment in how to do public and environmental health differently, and we've made a pretty big investment in seeing that experiment succeeds. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doctor. That's a great segue to our final panelist. Who's a principal?
Just ask a quick question.
Sure.
Hopefully it'll be a quick answer. Dr. Daston, thank you. What didn't come up today, and I'm curious from your perspective if you're thinking about it or concerned about it, is the process once it ends and a decision has been made. Are you concerned about kind of this regulatory treadmill for your company once you've actually completed a major or the major final step? Are you looking at that in terms of how that could impact costs and your operation and how you deliver product?
Yeah, that's a great point. For us, the biggest concern that we have is uncertainty. We can live with any decision that's made as long as we understand that it is the decision. That I think is our expectation at the conclusion of any of these alternatives assessment that we have a definitive answer. Now, we all understand that, times change, information changes that we might have, such that a decision might be revisited. But what we want to make sure is that based on the best available science, best available technology, that we have definitive results from the process. And I think that has to be like a success criterion.
Sorry about that. And thank you. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Ann Blake, who's a principal with Environmental and Public Health Consulting. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Whoops. Let's see if I can. Minor technical problem here. Here we go. Thank you, Chair, Vice Chair, and staff of this committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today on the topic of the Safer Consumer Product, Green Chemistry, and Formal Regulations. There's some advantages to going last. I can say yes to many of the above points, so I will try to be brief and highlight some of the points that have not yet been brought up. I am a scientist by training. I'm a regulator by experience. My PhD is in molecular genetics and neural development. I'm a former DTSC hazmat inspector for 10 years. I worked in the surveillance and enforcement, well, not quite 10 years. And my final position at DTSC in 2002 was Northern California Pollution Prevention Coordinator. So I have gone from the end of pipe to further upstream and continue to do so with these green chemistry regulations. Since 2002, I have been an independent consultant working on toxics reduction strategies and drivers to safer alternatives through environmentally preferable purchasing, standards and rating systems, chemicals policy with a very broad range of stakeholders, including state and local government, health and environmental nonprofits, coalitions, and business and academia. I also develop and teach curriculum on green chemistry with the UC Berkeley Extension Program. I teach policy and alternatives analysis at the UC Berkeley's Extension Program in green chemistry. So I wanted to touch on, and I think I will hopefully be able to touch on the question that Vice Chair Miller brought up recently about maybe decision guidelines on how we implement these regulations, and also touch on what my colleague Timothy Malloy brought up. But first, let me touch briefly on the issues of the utilization of the Green Ribbon Science Panel, and then some comments on the regulations themselves, and then some additional areas to highlight that I think have not been previously brought up. So as my colleague Meg Schwartzman has said, we all very much agree, I think, that there was a much improved use of the Green Ribbon Science Panel under the Brown administration, starting with conversations initiated by the co-chairs while Director Rafael was still was a co-chair of the committee early on in this year and initiating conversation with DTSC. We very much appreciate the use of subcommittees, which allowed us to provide more detailed input and substantive input covering both areas of disagreement and common ground, and I would agree with Meg Schwartzman that we did find more areas of convergence than we had expected in that process. So with that, we definitely feel like we have been better utilized, and that shows up in the regulations, the current draft of the regulations. Obviously, a vast improvement over the November 2010 draft that caused much heartburn and furor among the stakeholders. Greater clarity and consistency for sure, much more scientifically based and defensible. And clearly DTSC has not started from scratch, as Director Rafael has said, that has instead taken all the input from the last 3 years and has done an excellent job of navigating some really tricky areas by providing some regulatory certainty while also allowing flexibility for a program that, to be honest, nobody's ever tried to do precisely like this at this scale. As many of my colleagues have mentioned, it is a very good handling of a program within the constraints of AB 1879. I wanted to add my support and agreement to several of the points that have been brought up about adding a broad chemicals of concern list, while Dr. Daston's points are well taken, the cumulative exposures and so forth, and also the addition of workers to this. One of the things that we'd like to add is a broader definition of workers. One of the areas that I work in, I have worked in many of the sectors that will be covered by AB 1879. And one of the things that I have seen is that service workers, for example, who are exposed to unintended levels of exposure of consumer products, such as house cleaners that use on a multiple day basis products that have been designed for use maybe once a week in the home, or nail salon workers or others that have potentially a disproportionate aggregate exposure to chemicals in consumer products. So with that, I would like to add two additional areas that I actually Tim touched on in the decision-making area, and George as well. But as a former DTSC staff person, I'd like to point out that this is, of course, a very new program that goes well beyond the historical authority of DTSC. And staff will need guidance as well as financial support, which I will address shortly, in how to make the kinds of decisions that are being laid out in the two big areas of the alternatives assessment, interpretations of alternatives assessments that come through, and then making decisions about regulatory responses. Director Rafael laid out what the potential, and the current regs lay out what the regulatory responses are that are allowed within AB 1879. However, I think it would be extremely helpful to do perhaps in the regulations or very early on in the implementation process, even as the regulations are going through. I understand the impetus to get the regulations out since we are well past our regulatory deadline. But I think it needs to be fleshed out, perhaps likely scenarios and some decision rules about what kinds of situations would DTSC take certain regulatory responses. I believe that needs to be fleshed out, and I will have some substantive comments and ideas to submit to DTSC on that topic. Also, Tim Malloy and I and others at UCLA have worked on feasibility of decision-making models around alternatives assessment and the kinds of value judgments, inherent value judgments that need to go into these weighting decisions when you were faced with complex criteria and complex data that George has also addressed. And that's something that I think also needs to be fleshed out fairly early on. And I'm not quite sure whether that should be in the regulations. I do agree with Tim Malloy that there should be some decision rules at least. DTSC should start thinking about some of the scenarios. What are the likely outcomes of alternatives assessment? What kinds of decision rules would we make? What kinds of weighting would you make towards certain criteria? I think it is absolutely appropriate for an agency within Cal EPA whose mission is to protect public health and the environment to weight those criteria more heavily. And what we have found in our feasibility studies that even when that is the case, they may not be the driving criteria that economics may well be or performance may well be the driving criteria in an alternatives assessment. Okay, so one last thought on that. You mentioned, and I realize that this is not a popular thing to hear, that while the timelines are still short, this is not the answer to all current chemical problems that are impacting the workers, communities, and the environment of the state of California. So while I hate to say this, this committee should still expect single chemical or chemical restriction bills to come through, while not all bad actor chemicals are going to be dealt with in the next couple of years with the resources that DTSC's got in hand and with the list of chemicals that we have and the potential products that we have. Some bad actor chemicals that are having specific effects on communities and workers will still need to be addressed in this time while we ramp up this program. So my colleagues have addressed several issues inherent in the structure of AB 1879. I agree with them that within the limits of 1879, DTSC has crafted a program with which we can definitely move forward. I will not attempt to address the issues that, to the extent that Tim Malloy has. So I will just say that the key issues are the authority, specifically the ability to collect data. We are working in a context in which we have a backlog of chemicals currently on the market with, at best, insufficient, incomplete safety data, and we need a way to fill those data gaps. In my work in trying to encourage drivers for safer alternatives in the marketplace, in both institutional and consumer products, I have seen the issues that have been brought up play out in the following ways. Broad CBI claims for key ingredients have been a huge barrier to effectively assessing hazard to end users. And it's clear as this program plays out that we will be dealing with, how broadly can CBI claims be made. We've also experienced sector-wide non-disclosure of ingredients, particularly in cleaning products, for example. This has now been somewhat mitigated by that industry by a voluntary effort under consumer pressure. But these are the kinds of things that, without an information generation authority, are going to continue to happen. The final point is sufficient support. This is groundbreaking legislation, as has been mentioned. It is moving the state of California towards a more hazard-based approach coupled with a pragmatic evaluation of exposure. This creates in legislation for the first time an alternatives analysis process. As my colleagues have mentioned, this is only one plank of the Green Chemistry Initiative, and I wanted to point out that while this is a key way of starting to address the issue, I just wanted to put some numbers around. People have talked about the costs of the disease that we're dealing with, cost of the disease burden resulting from environmental exposures to chemicals, and also the potential regulatory costs. So I wanted to give us some numbers around that, and these will be somewhat conservative. It's not news that we are in economic difficulties, as is the world economy, but we can no longer afford or continue to afford the externalized cost of environmental exposures. Many of the chemicals we're talking about have been highlighted as contributing factors in the top public health concerns of our time, including obesity, heart disease, infertility, childhood developmental problems, among others. The good news is these are things that we can start to address. While it's challenging to gather some of the data on precisely what it costs and the impacts of environmental exposures, the World Health Organization estimates that globally 44% of asthma, 16% of cardiovascular disease, and 19% of all cancers can be contributed to environmental exposures. Obviously, we're talking well beyond consumer products, but those contribute. And what does this cost in terms of disease? Incidence of childhood cancers increased some 28% between 1974 and 1998, a space of 25 years, including some unusual ones, including non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The childhood prevalence of asthma doubled in that time. So the numbers that we have best are for a handful of childhood diseases. In 2008, and again, I would caution that these are underestimates at best, and this is for only a handful of diseases. In 2008, it was estimated that annual costs for lead poisoning, prenatal methylmercury exposure, cancer, asthma, and intellectual disability in children was above $77 billion. I know you used billion before I did, but here it is, $77 billion, and that's, again, for a subset of childhood diseases. Overall estimated costs, and these are estimated costs for the U.S., and this is from a decade ago. For exposure to toxic substances, again, these are for things that we can directly link to exposures, between 600 and 800 billion for the U.S. as a whole. So if we calculate what California's proportion of that is 10 to 15% of the U.S. economy. On the flip side of this, what is the cost and benefit of regulation? The Federal Office of Management and Budget this year, just a couple of months ago, submitted a report to Congress and estimated the investment in regulations in health, safety, and environmental regulations for the last decade. The costs were somewhere between 45 and 65 billion, so tens of billions. The benefits were 130 to 650, so hundreds of billions in benefit. That is a return of 300 to 700%, something we don't often see in our economy these days. So that's just my plea for, I realize it feels like an expensive thing to do, but these regulations are groundbreaking and worth supporting, as are the broader green chemistry regulations. Mr. Chair, in your introductory statement, you mentioned stimulating new areas of the economy, and I believe that this is an economic driver for that as well. Those regulations provide a regulatory floor below which we want the actors in our economy to not go. We also need incentives, so we need a combination of regulation and incentives. And I'd like to link this to existing economic incentives that have been provided by the state. In October of this year, the governor signed B or benefit corporation legislation. B Corps are a new kind of corporation which uses the power of business to solve social and environmental problems. Many of the companies that will be innovating in green chemistry are B Corps, and they now have the opportunity to be a B Corp in the 8th largest economy in the world. So there is an economic opportunity here. And I can tell you that working with small businesses with their innovative, safer alternative products, they are very often challenged in getting their products onto the market currently because there is no regulation that asks if a potentially hazardous chemical is necessary in a consumer product or if there's a better way to achieve the performance. So I'd like to leave you with that these are worth expanding and supporting. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
Questions? I would like to thank each and every one of you for coming here today, but also for your contributions that you've made to the Green Ribbon panel. It's been absolutely instrumental in helping us shape these final regulations, and the work of the different subcommittees earlier this year is obviously has borne some fruits in the regulations and their current status. So thank you, each and every one of you. And I know that I've gone over a lot of times, but I thought that it's an important area, and we wanted to hear from your folks. So thanks for taking the time out of your schedule. Next, we're going to go to stakeholders, and it's logical that we can't include all the wide range of stakeholders in the important process in a single hearing. I've asked a few of the stakeholders communities to give their perspective on the recent progress on the development of the draft regulations, and I'll ask that Marjorie Martz Emerson from Hewlett-Packard come forward, Davis Baltz from Change Coalition, Don Kopke from the Green Chemistry Alliance, and Kathy Gerwig from Kaiser Permanente. Thank you, each and every one of you. I'm probably running about 45 minutes late, so if you guys could be brief, why don't we start with you, Ms. Martz Emerson.
I want to say thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to speak. I have been at HP for a number of years. My background is in environmental health and environmental science, and HP has been a company that has taken protection of public health and the environment very seriously. I came in as a product steward, which is a program that started a lot of years ago, way back in the 90s, and product stewardship is about embedding technical environmental people into our product lines so that we look at this process from the very beginning and incorporate this into good design. So environmental is a very important feature. We have a lot of influence over how products are designed and have been able to change a lot of things over time. Much more recently, Helen has been involved in really establishing the work in alternative evaluation, where she's been looking at really comparing hazards of individual chemicals. So we're well into this program and have been for a number of years. So I would like to say that we do strongly support the protection of human health and the environment through this process of looking at better choices on chemicals up front, as well as substituting chemicals and non-regrettable substitutions later on. We also strongly support, as a company, good regulations. Regulations are an important part of the whole portfolio of achieving environmental goals and achieving health and safety-based goals. So both are needed. It is a balancing act. For the proactive stuff that we do and take part in is a critical balancing part of that is the regulatory framework that can allow us to collect better data. It's not just DTSC collecting better data, but allow us to collect better data to be able to look at some of the compounds that are present. So both are important. I'd like to emphasize that. We believe that DTSC has done a very good job of interacting with the stakeholders, has given us an opportunity to get engaged in and participate in this process of rule development. They have done a very good job in this informal draft. We believe it to be the best we have seen, and have really developed a good concept, a good framework, a good approach, and a meaningful process. And we believe it is doable, and we would that does not mean that we would not still like to refine, make changes as we go through the formal rulemaking process. There's always pieces that can be improved. But generally speaking, we think that the regulations have provided a good framework. And as we work on the detail of how that can be implemented, there will be lots of suggestions to come. We do support, and we thank them very much for considering the de minimis approach that is flexible, providing a default level, if you will, based on hazard, but being able to change that up or down as necessary to deal with the potential hazards and exposures that may occur within both from the chemical hazard perspective and the exposures that may occur with a specific product. We also are very pleased to see the phased approach that they have put into the draft regulations. We think it's important to be able to take this stepwise, that we can, the ability to exempt out if you really are not included within a specific thing, the ability to go through that first stage of the alternative assessment where you can eliminate alternatives that are not going to be better than what you have today. And then that final stage of really going through and looking at a very thorough analysis. We, too, like many of those who have spoken before, believe that good science is really an important part of alternatives assessment. And we would like, as we look forward, we would like to see good alternatives assessments. We don't believe, well, maybe I should say we are not convinced that the certification process is going to be sufficient to ensure that would happen. So we do believe that good technical peer review is an important part, but that we would like to add to that technical peer review part of this a multi-stakeholder approach. It should not be just an academic technical review, but it should include different perspectives across the stakeholders as they look at what has been done in alternatives assessment. We learn from others, and others learn from us. One of the things that I think is really important as we look across industry and the manufacturers that will be affected by this is that those who have been engaged in this for a long time have a responsibility for making sure we can share and making sure that for those who are small businesses and other people that they can find the right resources to do this. So that I think that's a very important part of this whole program. I think that we also have some very important interests in how the process develops. We agree that this is just the first step, if you will, in the Green Chemistry Initiative, and the things to follow are important. But at the same time, we need the time and the ability to be able to work through some of these things. So timeframes is something that's important to us. Information is something that is important to us. Transparency, quite frankly, is important to us for building trust, but it is one of those pieces that transparency, obviously, still does include some information that we will never want to share. And so I think what we do want to make sure is that we really can move forward in a very, shall we say, robust manner that we all gain out of this process and that we all come up with very viable alternatives out of this process that can't be done from outside. If you're an industry that, like us, that deals both in hardware, which might be a little simpler in some cases, as well as formulation of high-performance inks, for example, looking at what might be a viable alternative is something that probably only we can do. But as we look at those viable alternatives, we will look at how do we make assessments so we don't have to do this again. I think the thing that is probably one of our biggest concerns is we don't want to go through a process that ends up with we just changed a formulation because we needed to look at a specific ink. And I'm hoping that will not be good because we've done toxicology for years and years. But should that happen, we don't want to come back and do that same ink ever again. I mean, we want to look at this holistically. And so as we look at those pairings of chemicals of concern and priority products, we want to make sure that we have the flexibility, and I think you probably have heard that before, the flexibility and freedom to make sure that we solve the problem one time and not multiple times.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions? Mr. Boltz, please.
Good afternoon, Chairman Wilkowski, members of the committee. My name is Davis Baltz, here today representing my organization Commonweal, a health and environmental research and service organization in Bolinas, California, and the Change Coalition, Californians for a Healthy and Green Economy. We're a statewide coalition of public health, environmental justice, labor unions, and faith communities, and we have tracked and followed the development of the AB 1879 regulations from the beginning, and we're grateful to be here today to provide a public interest perspective. The first thing to say is that these regulations are historic in their own way. This is the first time an agency is attempting to regulate chemicals and the products that contain them by focusing first on intrinsic hazard traits rather than relying exclusively on risk assessment. Exposures will be considered, but the intention is to reduce exposures to hazardous chemicals rather than justify exposures through risk assessments. This is the first time an agency is building a regulatory structure that mandates an analysis of alternatives. This is the first time regulations are addressing cumulative exposures, which are a key public health concern and a long-time demand from environmental justice communities. And this is the first time, as you've heard, that manufacturers of consumer products will be required to formally answer the question, is the use of this hazardous chemical necessary in my product? This approach represents a long overdue paradigm shift in how we manage chemicals. There are many provisions in the draft that public interest groups support. For example, the large chemicals of concern list posted from the beginning is smart and will prompt forward-thinking entrepreneurs and businesses to voluntarily act before subsequent regulation compels them to. DTSC will require manufacturers to provide useful supply chain information to the department in their alternative assessment reports, as well as to identify what's called unavailable reliable information. They won't be required to fill these data gaps, but they will be required to identify where the gaps exist. And the regs will require manufacturers to fund, establish, and maintain an end-of-life management program. But the regulation should go further in some areas to strengthen California's leadership within this new regulatory environment. For example, DTSC should adopt the strictest possible de minimis standard of 0 for chemicals we already know are harmful, such as carcinogens, mutagens, and reproductive toxicants, persistent bioaccumulative toxins, and endocrine disruptors. The regs should make clear throughout the document that economic impacts include cost to families, the environment, public health, government, and the taxpayer. Workers should be afforded the same degree of protection as other populations. Better oversight of the alternative assessment reports that will be generated by industry is needed. And more defined criteria need to be developed for how and when regulatory responses that have real consequences will be triggered. Like everyone in this room, the Change Coalition wants to support the successful implementation of AB 1879. We are heartened by new leadership at Cal EPA, and in particular by the appointment by the Governor of Debbie Raffel as DTSC Director, who has served with dignity and professionalism. The deeper utilization of the state's Green Ribbon Science Panel is a very positive development. These informal draft regulations have put the train back on the tracks after the unacceptably weak and failed draft regs hastily put out a year ago in the 11th hour of the Schwarzenegger administration. But the regs are not perfect. It will be a heavy lift to do it right. These safer consumer product regulations should be viewed as an important step on the road to sustainability, one piece of the solution. What is needed now are additional planks in California's Green Chemistry Initiative, and this is where the legislature can help. As you have heard repeatedly today, DTSC does not have the resources to undertake this in a sustained way. We have heard from DTSC that only 2 to 5 product categories will be identified to start, and a final alternative analysis report will take 3 years if all goes smoothly. Providing DTSC with the means to implement this program, which will ultimately save the state millions of dollars in avoided health care costs and environmental remediation, should be a top priority for the legislature. Otherwise, even with excellent regulations, there won't be sufficient resources for DTSC to assume responsibility for the many functions it will need to take on for this program to succeed. A continuing critical problem is the stunning lack of information about chemicals available to the public and the marketplace. You've heard other speakers mention this already. We know very little or often nothing at all about the toxicity of chemicals in everyday use, which we voluntarily bring into our homes and apply directly to our bodies and those of our children. But the draft regulations are timid about requiring data to be provided or produced by industry. If we review how AB 1879 and California's Green Chemistry Initiative came into being, we'll recall its genesis was the 2006 special report by the University of California titled Green Chemistry in California, A Framework for Leadership in Chemicals Policy and Innovation. This report, as you heard from Dr. Schwartzman, was requested in 2004 by this committee and together with the Senate Environmental Quality Committee. The report pointed to 3 specific gaps, which have created a broad set of problems for public and environmental health, for industry and businesses, and for government in our state. By now, we're all familiar with these as the data gap, the safety gap, and the technology gap. These gaps need to be filled, and the informal draft regs fall short of doing it. It would be another highly significant and important contribution by the legislature to provide Cal EPA with the prerogative to bring needed information into the public sphere. A legislative effort to create a no data, no market mechanism is needed to level the playing field. This will drive chemicals with bad profiles off the market, as they will be deselected by the public and downstream business users of chemicals. Market forces, if supplied with the necessary information, can drive innovation as smart companies invest in safer alternatives. This will create jobs. But for this to happen, excessive trade secret provisions must be limited so that information about the health and safety properties of chemicals and consumer products is publicly available, and the public understands how alternative analyses are conducted and approved. Without this transparency, there is a substantial risk that the program won't be seen as credible by the people of California. One of the key rationales for AB 1879 was to stop the flow of chemical-by-chemical ban bills. What has California done to restrict the use of known toxic chemicals since AB 1879 was signed into law in 2008? It is a somewhat bitter irony that the goal of no more chemical bills has essentially been achieved, but we still don't have a plan in place to retire problematic chemicals, although it is in process. The number of chemical bills has fallen to a trickle as everyone waits for green chemistry to answer all questions. Yet we know now that the safer consumer product regulations will be modest in the best of circumstances. In the last legislative session, only one bill made it to the governor's desk that would restrict a chemical of concern, limiting bisphenol A in baby bottles and sippy cups. And the previous year, there were only about 5 bills that sought to reduce exposure to specific chemicals. The legislature has gotten its wish. No more chemical ban bills. But I know you will agree with me that it is not the intent of the legislature to ignore public and environmental health threats from toxic materials. Since 2008, more than 500,000 babies have been born each year in California. For these new Californians, successful chemical ban bills since 2008 would at least have protected them from substances we already know are harmful. To be meaningful, the safer consumer product regulations, once finalized, would certainly need to deal with these chemicals for which we already have enough information to act. We've lost 3 years of opportunity to restrict chemicals we know are dangerous without putting a significant dent in harmful exposures to 1.5 million children born since then. This is the final challenge and responsibility for the legislature: to recognize that there is still an important role for chemical-specific bans that protect Californians quickly and hold DTSC's feet to the fire to move as fast as possible through the new regulatory framework. Finally, I call attention to a recent opinion piece published in the Huffington Post by Catherine Alcantar, who is Policy Director at the Center for Environmental Health. And I believe you have this in front of you now. As a pregnant woman, she points out that the baby girl in her womb already has all the eggs she will ever have in her lifetime for her own children. Think about this. The chemicals that Catherine is exposed to now can impact her grandchildren whose mother has not been born yet. It is all of our responsibility to ensure that Catherine's children and grandchildren-to-be are protected so they can reach their full potential. In conclusion, the regulations under development today have much that is worthy of support, and despite their limitations, it's important to launch this program. But this is only one piece of the work. The legislature now has the important responsibility of building out our state's green chemistry initiative so toxic chemicals and products are expeditiously retired from commerce and replaced by safer alternatives. This will entail ensuring that DTSC and other agencies have the resources to fulfill their statutory mandates, that adequate information about chemicals reaches the public, and there is a duty for the legislature to take faster action on toxic chemicals when evidence warrants. Well, thank you again for the chance to testify today, and we certainly do appreciate your continued oversight of the Green Chemistry Initiative.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Kopke.
Thank you, Chair and members. Dawn Kepke with McHugh and Associates Government Relations on behalf of the California Manufacturers and Technology Association. I also serve along with my fellow co-chair, John Ulrich, as another co-chair of the Green Chemistry Alliance, which is a coalition made up of over 150 state and federal trade associations, as well as individual companies who have all been working very diligently over the last 3 years and beyond to ensure that we're working towards a program that is workable and science-based and really meets the intent of the enacting statutes. Our record demonstrates our proactive, solutions-oriented approach to this. We very early on drafted our own regulatory framework that we felt met the statutory requirements and the intent of the enacting legislation. Have since that time spent countless thousands of hours in terms of our own research and efforts to provide solutions through documents and meetings over the last 3 years. So we are committed to making this a workable and science-based program. We do feel, as was mentioned by a few other persons that spoke, that there are some positives in this regulation, such things as AA flexibility, alternative assessment flexibility, we believe that starting off small with a 2 to 5 product chemical combination makes sense to ensure that we are headed in the right direction and we're focused in that attempt to get this program off the ground. And there are other things that we support with a focus on traditional consumer products, not looking at tank cars and satellites as consumer products in this. It makes sense to focus on those products that were intended by the regulation, which are true consumer products. Other points, but given the time constraints, I'm afraid I'll have to skip over the rest of them, but we're certainly happy to chat with you more about those. We share the goal of making this a practical and meaningful, legally defensible framework. We are committed to that and have demonstrated that. However, there are a number of things that we feel are provisions within this regulation, as well as those within OEHA's hazard trait regulation, that make some of those goals challenging in a few areas. Specifically, starting with the chemical of concern list of lists, we have great concern with that. We are concerned that such a significant number of chemicals that aren't based in consistent and science criteria is a concern for us. There are, from our perspective and what we've done in terms of reviewing the list that the department has included in the draft reg, that includes over 4,000 chemicals and substances as well as compounds that are of great concern, and some that are not meaningful whatsoever. Such things that we've identified on these various lists: coffee, oxygen, leather dust, metals, sodium, and what have you. These sorts of substances that don't make sense. And so we really are pushing very strongly that we look to develop a chemicals of concern program based on sound science and consistent criteria among various authoritative bodies. We also are concerned within the regulation that the regulation lacks, both with DTSC as well as OEHA's hazard trait regulation, consistent thresholds as well by which to evaluate these chemicals of concern. We're also concerned because these lists contain drugs and pesticides that were explicitly exempted by the statute. We understand from the department that they are looking to pull those out, but that remains a concern about how that would be handled. And we would just note that lists are created and based on hazards, not necessarily on use and exposure. And we would remind the committee, as was mentioned previously, that it's not just about hazard. Exposure is a key important part of this. That's what we get to consumer products. Exposure is a key part of reviewing those products. And so we shouldn't be focused just on hazard. That would be false, and that would be getting away from the intent of the statute from our perspective. We feel that DTSC should prioritize chemicals and then prioritize those products with those chemicals of concern. And we're concerned that the prioritization piece, particularly with the chemicals side of it, is not to the extent based, again, in clear, consistent criteria and science. And what we've suggested is a specific set of criteria by which to evaluate these chemicals, and taking essentially references from EPA's IUR inventory update rule and FDA list that provide for a focused measure of what chemicals are specifically used in consumer products, rather than looking at a very large list of chemicals that have no relevance for consumer products. And so we've talked with the department and are continuing those discussions about how we can prioritize this based on what is actually in consumer products, rather than just a list that doesn't make sense for consumer product regulation. Also concern relative to the product prioritization process. The statute provides for a process. It's very clear in the statute to identify and prioritize chemicals of concern in consumer products. And what we're concerned about relative to this point is that the regulations do not provide a clear prioritization process and steps to get from what they have indicated from their perspective is 3,000 chemicals down to 2 to 5 products with those chemicals in them. And that's a concern not only for the immediate future once these regulations are in place, but for out years in prioritizing product chemical combinations. We're concerned that the narrative standard that DTSC is looking at lacks clarity and consistent criteria to do that prioritization in the near term as well as out term, and we're concerned that that ultimately could be not necessarily by the current staff and administration, whom we have great respect for and work very closely with and productively, but are concerned that that could be used from kind of a politicized standpoint because it lacks that clear and consistent criteria, could be used to basically elevate the product and chemical du jour rather than focus on the science behind those choices that are based in strong science-based criteria. We also are concerned about the de minimis threshold. While we agree that the flexibility in terms of the ability to raise and lower, which was something we had proposed to the department, we're concerned about the baseline threshold at 0.01%. That overlooks federal and internationally established baselines used both in the EU as well as here in the United States and in California. And so we are concerned about that as the baseline threshold. And so we've advocated that departments start with a different threshold that's consistent with other systems and be able to raise and lower thereafter based on that particular chemical and its properties and exposure. And I know we're short on time. So with regard to the alternatives assessment, we have concerns relative to the timelines. And in some cases, those time frames for alternatives assessment may be workable. For other more complex products, it may not be workable. And so we're certainly going to be continuing to work with the department to make sure that there's enough flexibility to account for differences in products and the availability of alternatives out there for those. We also have concerns about, within the draft, about the evaluation and consideration of externalities. We're concerned that there are varied opinions on what constitutes externalities for the purposes of this regulation. Furthermore, there are concerns that such an approach and such an effort to review externalities at this point in time would be unworkable, as there's no consistent and agreed upon frameworks for evaluating these externalities from a very specific product chemical combination in all instances. So that could be, we expect to be a challenge going forward in that specific scenario.
Couldn't that be discussed in the assessment? I mean, isn't the manufacturer saying that the use of this in this chemical in this product is limited to these externalities and not this other combination, if it was baby products or whatever it was? I mean, it seems to me at a basic level that would be something that if it was identified, if you had one of the lucky 2 or 3, that you would that would be included in the assessment.
Right. I think our concern goes to differing opinions that we've received relative to what constitutes those externalities and how broad those need to be reviewed. And so that's something we're working with the department on to clarify. Certainly in some instances and relative to some aspects that probably would be workable, but not necessarily in all instances for all very specific product chemical combinations, and depending on what externalities were expected to be reviewed.
And how about the peer review? Because it seems if you got something that you disagreed with, that the peer review based on the science would justify a differencing of opinion between DTSC and the manufacturer or the product I mean, if we're based on science, I'm trying to figure out, doesn't that solve itself? If you say, well, no, that's really not a relevant element or condition.
Well, relative to the peer review for alternative assessments, that's not something that CMTA and the Green Chemistry Alliance has spoken about specifically. I think on its face, initially, we would have some concerns with confidential business information in that type of approach, given the sensitivity with a lot of the information that will be included in those alternatives assessment reports and processes. That I think will be a challenge to a peer review process for AAs. But as far as externalities go, I mean, I think it's more, again, about clarifying with department to what extent those need to be reviewed and how those would be managed based on what their kind of interpretation in terms of how far you go. In
right, because the real catch is the regulatory response. I mean, while you're arguing about it, or what you're looking at conditions, what you're really concerned with, or I'm putting words into your mouth, is that what's the regulatory response, and then what would be that appeal or that, the outcome, I guess.
Well, speaking of regulatory responses, just a couple quick points on that, if I may. We have some concerns about the criteria or lack of clarity around the criteria for how each regulatory response is chosen. So, as you can imagine, each of these different points of concern feed into the next step. And so we feel that there are definitely some workability issues as you go through the process with some of these items. But beyond just the lack of clear criteria for choosing regulatory responses, there are some specific regulatory responses that we think have workability issues. For example, the extended producer responsibility product stewardship type regulatory response, there are going to be significant challenges potentially to that with antitrust issues. And might I add, antitrust issues also could come into play earlier with challenges for kind of having trade associations, kind of consortia working on alternative assessments for groupings of companies as well.
Help me out with that. So is the argument that the response that the DTSC would make, the manufacturer would say this violates the United States antitrust laws because they're not allowing us to use this product?
I know I know that there are a few other people here that could probably speak more directly to this issue. I'm not an expert in this particular piece of this, but it's my understanding from a standpoint of setting up a product stewardship type program that there are challenges in manufacturers working together for a particular type of product to deal with that. And so antitrust issues have to be addressed, and in this regulation, those are not addressed whatsoever. So if I may, I'd like to defer that to potentially someone in the audience that might be able to speak to that, or perhaps we can follow up more specifically and get you more clear information, because, again, I'm not the expert on that particular point, if that's okay. Thank you. And then as far as just confidential business information, I mean, important piece of the statute really was to push for innovation and provide the opportunity for innovation. And there's been a lot of discussion about confidential business information today and the need to perhaps lessen those protections. And we would argue that in order to maintain that innovation that's currently going on and to even expedite and grow that innovation, the confidential business information piece of this becomes even ever more important to protect the efforts and the investment that these companies are putting into these alternatives assessments and developing these safer alternatives that are envisioned by this program. And so I would just place a cautionary note that any lessening of those confidential business interest protections is going to have severe implications for innovation. And just closing it out, I would just like to say that, the Green Chemistry Alliance and CMTA and all of our coalition members are continuing to work with the department to address these concerns. We've had very productive conversations. We envision that will continue and look forward to setting up a program that is workable and science-based. And the final note that I would just close on that was just based on earlier discussion is relative to the resource issue. We do not disagree that resources are obviously a constraint for the department. However, when we talk about the need to increase fees and what have you, the Green Chemistry Alliance, CMTA, and industry as a whole really believes that it's premature to have that discussion. We're in a draft stage right now with this current draft regulation. We do not know what the end result is going to be based on the discussions that the department is having on all these various components. And so we don't know what the cost is going to be of this program to be able to even quantify what the needs are in terms of providing for a fee, much less who is going to be responsive to this program. And those are some significant challenges that need to be, thought out, and questions that need to be answered before we can even go down that road and understand what the costs are, not only from a business perspective, but department and state perspective as well as who's responsive to this, because the statute provides for very broad authority, and yet if particular product categories aren't even going to be contemplated, then how can you charge a fee on that particular product if they're not even responsive to this? So we do have some major concerns about that, but do look forward to continuing that dialogue. Thank you.
And finally, Ms. Gerwig.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I'm Kathy Gerwig. I'm Vice President and Environmental Stewardship with Kaiser Permanente, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today from a stakeholder perspective. The perspective I'm sharing is as a downstream user. At Kaiser Permanente, we're like a big consumer, and we suffer the problems individual consumers face as they try to use products that do not contribute to diseases. And I'm just going to take a few minutes to run through some key points. The key messages I wanted to share with you today are, number one, that Kaiser Permanente is very supportive of the Green Chemistry Initiative, and we appreciate the excellent work of Director Rafael and department staff in moving it forward. The second key point is that we want to shift the burden of assessing what's safe from downstream users and consumers to upstream manufacturers. And third, that we're encouraged by the new proposal and the work of the Green Ribbon Science Panel. At Kaiser Permanente, we've worked hard to reduce our overall impact on the environment. We're building some of the greenest hospitals in California. We purchase 190 tons of locally and sustainably grown food every year. We're in the process of installing 15 megawatts of solar energy in our California facilities right now. And we have a big initiative to use products that contain safer chemicals. We have a significant presence in California. We have almost 7 million health plan members. We have 34 hospitals, hundreds of medical office buildings, more than 120,000 employees, more than 10,000 physicians in California. We spend billions of dollars each year on products in this state. Despite that leverage, we have limitations in achieving our goal of using products and materials that are environmentally sustainable. I mentioned that we want to see the burden shifted from downstream consumers like us, and I wanted to explain how we've addressed that burden up to now. In 2008, we adopted an internal guideline that regards chemical ingredients and products, and here's our internal aim. We aim to advance an economy where the production and use of chemicals are not harmful for humans or the environment. Now, we don't make anything, but we use a lot of things, and yet we're still aiming to advance an economy. And so toward that end, we have created some quite elaborate mechanisms to try to prevent our purchase of products that contain harmful chemicals. One example is that we instituted a sustainability scorecard. This scorecard requires our suppliers of medical products to disclose specified chemicals in their products. This includes things like chemicals listed in Prop 65. They do that at the point of bid, and they do that for every single product that they're bidding. We ask them to indicate also if they have safer alternatives available. Their answers are scored, and they're made part of the product selection committee's decision, and it frequently ends up being the competitive factor. We've given the scorecard to Practice Green Health, which is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to improving hospital environmental performance. And we're collaborating with them and lots of healthcare systems to promote the use of this tool widely in the healthcare sector. And our latest estimate is that the tool is now influencing $130 billion worth of spend in the healthcare sector. So that's a big success, right? Well, we're proud of the accomplishment, but we'd much rather have upstream manufacturers and others involved in the design and distribution of products to ensure their product safety so that we don't have to. We can't assess if all alternatives that are claimed to be safer than the known hazards are really safer, and that shouldn't be our responsibility anyway. So we see the Green Chemistry Initiative and the draft regulations as movement very much in the right direction and in alignment with promoting a healthy economy, a healthy environment, and healthy people. Thank you.
Questions? Well, thank you very much for your contributions. And please, I encourage each of you, as well as members of the public who will be coming up, to share your comments during this informal process. Let's move to the public comment period. I'll ask members of the public to come forward. We do have 4 working mics. Mr. Alio, if you introduce yourself, you can start it off, and I think people know the routine.
I'm Bill Alio with the Environmental Working Group. I'm pulling up a web page here to quote. There we go. So I wanted to just talk about one subject, and that's funding the program. Everyone talks about a robust program. It's a word that's starting to be overused, but Dr. Malloy talked about we have to be aware of, that the effects on industry in this economy and all that. I just wanted to point out, for example, in the last quarter, Procter & Gamble, who produces a number of consumer products, posted profits of about $22 billion in the quarter on sales over $100 billion. So yeah, about $21.92 billion in profit in one quarter. So when we're talking about someone walking out of a store with a bottle of Pantene shampoo where 1/10 of a cent is assessed on that to run the program, if we get down to Pantene shampoos being considered as a product of a high priority product, I'm not saying it will be, but that's the kind of stuff we're talking about. 1/10 of a cent on consumer products to fund this program. We'll never have a robust program if we wait for the general fund to be made whole or whatever. So just the consumer products that will be regulated, tiny amounts assessed over these millions of products in California will allow them to have a robust program. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Catherine Alcantar. I represent the Center for Environmental Health and Change Coalition. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I second the comments that my colleagues have made from the Change Coalition today, and I just wanted to add one additional one, which is regarding the scope of the products prioritized. And we understand the limitations, the resource limitations, and that being part of the driving force around the department focusing on the 2 to 5 products in the first few years. But from a public perspective, such a narrow list is a big concern. And so one recommendation that we have, and the reason it's a concern is regarding sort of the goals of the Green Chemistry Initiative program to truly be comprehensive, to be meaningful, and to really spur innovation within industry for safer products. And so one recommendation we have, you've seen the diagram that DTSC has proposed before where you have sort of these shrinking bubbles, is that we have more something along the lines of a Venn diagram, where you have a larger list of chemicals of concern and a larger list of products of concern, and the focus of the priorities being on that intersection point. And that could be a 2 to 5, or, in our preference would be a little bit bigger than that in the first few years. But the reason around asking for a larger list of products is for the same reason that DTSC chose the larger list of chemicals of concern, and that truly is to send a signal to the market. And we feel that this would also help alleviate some of the concerns that we've heard the industry say about the time needed to do alternatives assessment, the time needed to innovate new products, et cetera. So having sort of this larger list with a phased-in approach, where you have certain products focused in the first few years, it would send that signal to the market, give the industry time to really innovate products, knowing that certain products will be of concern and be dealt with in future years, and would also help alleviate the public concern that here we are waiting for this great, comprehensive, meaningful program, and yet we're looking at a time frame of like 2 to 5 products in the first 5 years. There are thousands of chemicals out there, thousands and thousands of products out there, and so kind of give the public a little bit more faith in the program that it is truly meaningful. So that's just one additional comment that I wanted to add. And again, the issues of fees and other things that my colleagues have raised, we agree with as well. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair and members, Lori Nelson on behalf of the Consumer Specialty Products Association. And these bills passed because the legislature, industry, enviros, and NGOs, we all joined hands and we took a leap of faith. And we wanted to give these decisions to the state scientists, and that's the public good. And I think that for this program to be effective, it's going to take that same level of commitment from all the parties to make it a workable program. You want to protect public health and safety, but you also want to create products that consumers desire, and we also need to protect our trade secrets. And I would say that despite the eloquence and approachability of the director, there do remain several unresolved issues for my members, including the unintentionally added chemicals concern, the de minimis level that does not reflect international standards, the sheer number of chemicals in play, etc. And I would say that we've heard a number of times how these regulations are groundbreaking, so it gives us pause when people already want to come back to the legislature. They want to talk about additional chemicals. They want to talk about fees. And when you talk about sending a message to the marketplace, I would respectfully suggest that if you have a threat to trade secret protection, that will not encourage the millions of dollars that you need to innovate and create new chemicals and products. So I would just end saying, anything we can do to encourage the tone to remain collaborative, it's going to take all of our best efforts to make this successful. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members, Justin Malone on behalf of the California League of Conservation Voters. I would like to echo what my friend has just said. We have taken a big leap of faith. The California League of Conservation Voters was an early and a strong supporter of the enabling legislation. We do have a few concerns. We do want to commend Director Rafael and her reg writing crew, and also want to associate ourselves very closely with 3 core issues that were raised by the Green Ribbon panel. Data. If the department does not have explicit authority to require data where needed, it needs to get that authority. Secondly, it's asinine to think that a department can do such a huge project without any funds. There needs to be some funding mechanism. We're not saying fund everything all up front, but there are many, many creative and legitimate legal ways of providing some money to this department. Frankly, it's a sham. If we expect these people to do this work mandated by statute without any additional funds, when other parts of their programs are already hemorrhaging, I think this is a sham. Thirdly, as you heard from the Green Ribbon panel, there needs to be a process by which this decision framework for the choice of alternatives is tightened up. Otherwise, I think the program lacks the sort of teeth that it needs. It's all very well being collaborative. It's all very well having voluntary submissions. But at some point, we've got to recognize this is a regulatory program. This is not a volunteer program. And we want to be as collaborative as possible. But there needs to be teeth in this process, and certainly this one element of tightening up the decision framework is one. Thirdly, we hope that there's an opportunity to possibly look at ways in which we could streamline or expedite this process for those products that have end-of-life problems, not so much normal use problems. And there could be an EPR track that we can get to it more efficiently, more quickly. So we'd like to explore that in more detail, given the paucity of money, given the need to get some early successes in this program, and recognizing that, honestly, if we only do 2 to 5 chemicals a year or every couple of years, it's going to take decades to get this project completed. And finally, we've spoken about this before, but honestly, we beg the legislature, and you in particular, not to preclude legislative action. There may be occasions when we need to take action in the legislature for a number of reasons. And you heard the director herself say that in some occasions there may be a need for legislative action over and above this regulatory action. And we stand by the need to at least have the opportunity to take to the legislature a case that some chemicals need to be treated in a certain way, not always banned, but the legislature should retain its authority and its public trust obligation to deal with some of these issues and not completely delegate it to the regulatory agency, given the fact that this regulatory agency is so severely hampered in its capacity to tackle this huge task. So again, we appeal that we don't shut the door on legislative action. I think everybody would like to be responsible. We don't want to flood the legislature with single product bans. But if there's a solid case to be made, we don't believe it's in the public interest to preclude some consideration of bans in the legislature as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Change Coalition and Center for Environmental Health, and I wanted to speak to the needs to protect workers. So workers are often the first and the worst exposed. They're literally on the front lines, either in production of chemicals or and using the chemicals themselves. And to that end, I think that the workers need to be explicitly included in sensitive populations in that definition. And also the, I'm sure you do this too, but you eat your lunch at your desk or wherever your workplace is. Workers do that too. And so it's critical that their workplaces are protected as well. To that end, we think that the included in the definition of exposure needs to be included oral exposure as well. And again, I want to echo that the consumer products are used by workers, and they're not just industrial chemicals are used. And I was hanging out with a group of household workers yesterday, and I was hearing about the skin irritation that they encounter from using Windex and Clorox bleach and all these things. And so I'd really urge the committee to take action and make sure that workers are included in these regulations.
I'm Lori Chen. I'm out of Clean Water Action. We have 85,000 members in California, and we hear from them a lot. And they really want this process to move forward. And the end point isn't just the worker, it's also the water quality. Many of these ingredients are ending up as what we're calling emerging contaminants in our water supply, which needs to be protected because it's so expensive to purify the water supply, and it's so expensive to treat the ailments that result from not being able to catch them. So we see this as a point at which the big list is a list that are being transparent to industry and saying, this is what we want to prevent these contaminants from being an issue for the public. And that way, you can embrace this opportunity to create products that will, they won't need to go through the regulatory process. You know what doesn't need to be in there. You'll be able to look at this list and say, okay, let's make our products free of all these things, and then the public will be protected. The regulatory process will be a small burden, and we'll achieve these endpoints of healthy worker situations and healthy water for us, and everybody will be happy. It can be embraced instead of fought.
Thank you. It takes a second.
Hi, Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Samara Geller, and I'm also here representing the Environmental Working Group. I just wanted to briefly echo the sentiments of my fellow Change Coalition members regarding the de minimis standard. I just want to preface my comment with the acknowledgement that the current de minimis standard of 0.01% currently proposed by DTSC is better than what previously existed. It does go beyond the international standard of 0.1%. However, we do believe There is no scientific justification for assigning such a threshold, especially for certain chemicals such as BPA, where this science has shown there to be no threshold for health impacts. This is also especially important for chemical categories like carcinogens, mutagens, reproductive toxicants, and those chemicals that are persistent and bioaccumulative. So we encourage a zero de minimis, and chemicals should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. We believe this current de minimis level sends the wrong message to product manufacturers that if their products contain 0.1% or less of a chemical, then that product is indeed safe. So we encourage you and the committee to take a closer look at this. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Annie Pham with Sierra Club California, and I'm just here to echo what a lot have said about the lack of funding, and we're very concerned about that. We feel that it will not be a robust enough program to address enough products to create an effect on what's out there in the market already. And our members in California want us to go back to the legislature and ask for more there. Also, we're worried about the time frame, how long it would take for the whole process to take. And as a mother of an infant son, just to think that he will be in first grade before products that are potentially harmful to him will be taken off the shelf or whatever the case might be. So, thank you.
Mr. Chair, members, Joe Gregorich with the Toy Industry Association. TIA represents roughly 500 toy makers, distributors, importers, and inventors and retailers nationwide, and roughly 30% of those companies are headquartered here in California. We're here today just to briefly express some of the concerns that we will be communicating to DTSC later this month with the draft regulation. First, TIA and our members have been long been leaders in toy safety. Several decades ago, developing a voluntary toy safety standard that actually in 2008 was made federally mandated law under the CPSIA. And so with this, we urge stronger protections for regulatory duplication. We believe that current section doesn't go far enough to make sure that what we have under the CPSIA is addressed here in California. And then moving on to that, also we would urge DTSC to look at what other states have done in this area. Both Washington State and Maine have passed similar legislation specific to children's products, and those laws have now been adopted and the rules finalized. And a couple points in those laws that we would urge the department to look at are in terms of their definition of intentionally added products, contaminants, and due diligence and de minimis. We believe that those programs have addressed and established reasonable and good programs in there, and actually Washington and Maine adopted the exact same language. So we are having to do the same thing in Washington and Maine, and we believe that it would go a long way if California went down the same path, specifically for our industry. With that, we will be submitting more detailed comments at the end of the month, and we look forward to working with the department and your guys' committee as we move forward in the next year.
Mr. Chairman and members, Tim Shestak with the American Chemistry Council. I just first want to recognize the department and its leadership and staff for being open to meeting with a lot of the stakeholders. I mean, at the end of the day, we may or may not agree on the final outcome, but I do want to recognize that the department has been available and willing to meet and discuss in detail some of the issues that we have raised. I just wanted to briefly mention that there's a lot of discussion today about chemical data availability and the lack of and the need to provide the department more authority to mandate information from not only chemical manufacturers but perhaps downstream users as well. I just hope the committee, I just want to make sure that the committee doesn't leave today's hearing with the impression that there isn't a lot of work going on, has been going on, and currently going on as it relates to chemical data collection and making that information available to the public. So over the course of the next few weeks, certainly I don't want to over the holidays, suggest that you look into deeply what U.S. EPA is doing in terms of this area, but shortly thereafter it would be, I think, a benefit to the committee and others to really get a good handle as to what is required under the new U.S. EPA chemical data reporting rule. I think you're going to have a host of information available as it relates to use, volume, potential exposures, individual kind of industry classifications in terms of data, that information coupled with efforts going on globally to make chemical information available to the public, I think the department can really utilize that information in going forward. The informal draft regs do recognize that there is a process of looking at publicly available information and then kind of moving down before you get to the point of mandating information. Certainly there's probably going to be instances when not all that data is available, and I know from ACC's perspective, if the department were to come to us and ask for some information, certainly we'd be willing to have that kind of discussion. So I just don't want the committee to leave today thinking that there isn't any available information about chemicals, nor is there a lot of work not going on to make sure that that information is available to not just the public but to regulators as well. So with that, I'll echo Mr. Gregorich's comments that we're going to be submitting information and comments to the informal regs, and would like to sit down with folks on the committee and try to walk through what kind of information is available and how the department might be able to leverage that information. So thank you.
Final speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Mike Wilson. I'm the Associate Director of Integrative Sciences for the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry and a member of the Green Ribbon Science Panel. And just a brief comment, as we've watched this process unfold over the last 7 years, and attended dozens of meetings and a number of hearings here, as well as a hearing in D.C. on this process with the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee there. Obviously, they're very interested in what's happening here, and we've participated in an ongoing way in the development of these regulations, I was surprised to hear some of the concerns earlier from the trade association representatives around the new regulations, in that what we've been hearing from downstream businesses particularly, and from a room full of investors 2 weeks ago in San Francisco, convened by the Cradle to Cradle Institute, is that businesses that use these products, investors that are looking for safe and promising, entities within which to place their capital, are seeking what investors are calling radical transparency. We've just been hearing this in the last few months. It's becoming a bit of the lexicon now, and that it's a in sort of the context of the last 7 years, it seems to be a sea change, if you will, and we're finally hearing the voices of investors stepping forward and seeing the reality of these regulations, the fact that they are clearly written, as you've heard articulated by the members of the panel today. They're clearly written. They're implementable. This is within reach. Investors are beginning to take this seriously. And as a consequence, are stepping forward. And I was inspired by the meeting convened by Cradle to Cradle, and hearing companies describe how this large set of chemicals, for the first time, is going to give them the universe within which they can work. 3,000 chemicals, if that's what it is the universe that they can finally understand, is the framework that they need to work within, and the materials they need to be moving away from, and moving away from companies that are utilizing and relying on those substances, for example. So my hope is that the trade associations will see the advantage of that for California businesses. You've heard here from HP and from Kaiser. I would encourage you, of course, keep your doors open to the trade associations, but take every opportunity you can to hear directly from California businesses and from those individuals who are very interested in investing in this state and its economic development. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that concludes our hearing on safer consumer products. I see it as an organic regulatory process, and I encourage everyone to make their comments during this draft phase. I'm also going to emphasize again that the green chemistry regulations is an issue of heightened concern for California. Make no mistake that California is the leader in this area of regulation and the area of response to our population and consumers. And the mantra that the department has set up, that we have meaningful, practical, and legally defensible regulations, is one that I embrace. And whether you agree with the de minimis standards that have been set forth in regulations, you think they should be higher or should be lower, or the regulatory response are unclear, I encourage everyone to put their comments in. I'm committed to having the green chemistry regulations remain on track and become finalized regulations soon, in the coming year. I've picked the month of July, and I think the industry and consumers place the utmost importance, and they have the utmost confidence in the legislature and the agency. The program must work, and it must work well. I thank everybody for participating today, particularly my colleague, Vice Chair Miller. I look forward to being kept abreast by stakeholders and the agency on the development. We'll be setting, once we reconvene in January, the committee will set forth its schedule on our continuing oversight responsibility. And as I've reached the 3.5-hour mark of this hearing, I once again thank everybody for their participation. We're adjourned.